Introduce the speaker. Marcos.
Hi, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for being here. Tonight, we will have a Dr. Lucas Majure here with us, giving a talk on the cactus of the Caribbean. Dr. Lucas is a plant systematist and curator of the University of Florida Herbarium. He received his PhD from the University of Florida in 2012 and then completed a 2-year postdoc at the University of Florida Herbarium. He worked also as a researcher at the Desert Botanical Garden in Phoenix, Arizona, until fall 2018, when he came back to University of Florida to become a curator of the herbarium. He has a strong background in plant taxonomy and floristics, especially in the southeastern US and the Caribbean. Most of his systematic and evolutionary work is focused on the two families, the Cactaceae and Melastomataceae. And for the past several years, he and colleagues have been heavily focusing on the cacti and melastomes of the Caribbean, especially on the islands of Cuba and Hispaniola, in an effort to build a more true understanding of a species relationship, biogeographic history, and the timing of establishment of those groups on the islands. This work is also yielding interesting insights into the formation of seasonality of dry tropical forests and high mountain forests, which are very common on biodiverse in the Greater Antilles. So we welcome Dr. Lucas Majure to the Botanical Society of Washington. Yeah, we are pleased to hear more about this interesting work. Thank you.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys. While I'm doing that, I just want to say thank you very much for having me here tonight. It's a pleasure to be with everyone, and I can't wait to share a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing in Antilles. So as Marcos was saying in the introduction, so colleagues and I have been working on cacti in the Antilles for a number of years now with several major goals in mind. One of those is just determining what species actually occur in the islands. So working out the evolutionary history, species relationships of those species, of taxa across the islands. And also we're super interested in how those taxa actually made it into the islands, and then where there has actually been in situ evolution in the islands, how that has occurred. And we're trying to work out the overall ages of when those things happened as well, to give us a better idea of the overall formation of some of these tropical dry forests in the Antilles, and the overall sort of origin of the diversity of cacti in these areas. So I want to get started here. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn our focus to the Greater and Lesser Antilles, the Bahamas. This is a really amazing area with, it's one of the top 5 biodiversity hotspots in the world. So to encompass such a small area, it has a very high number of species, many of these species of which are actually endemic to the islands. You can imagine in thinking about, the populating of these islands by different organismal groups. Okay, we have North America, Central America, and South America relatively closely adjacent to the island. So we have a lot of potential area from which to draw on diversity in terms of, the overall population of these islands from, say, ancestral forms of what we might find there today. So over the past several years, colleagues and I have really been focusing on Cuba and Hispaniola, as Marcos mentioned in the introduction. And one of the amazing things about Cuba and Hispaniola here is that there's lots of seasonally dry tropical forest in these areas. So I have an insert of a map by Pennington et al. From 2000 showing the overall extent of seasonally dry tropical forests throughout the Americas. And you can see that Cuba, Hispaniola, the Bahamas, and other parts of the Antilles actually have lots of this forest type. Sorry, I'm just going to... Okay. All right, sorry about that, you guys. You know, with a forest type such as seasonally dry tropical forest, it's a really fantastic habitat for cacti to occur in. And within this region, we have an upwards of 94 taxa within the family Cactaceae that are either widespread species that occur in these areas or are endemic taxa that occur in these areas. Actually, roughly 3/4 of these 94 taxa are endemic to the Greater Lesser Antilles and Bahamas, so the Antilles as a whole. If we look at some of the diversity of the cacti that occur, for instance, in Cuba and Hispaniola, there are a number of things that sort of jump out automatically. So we have genera such as Melocactus that you can see on the top left-hand part of the screen. We have the genus of Pontia, which is much more diverse in Western North America. We have the genus Harissia, which is common throughout the Antilles, but it's also found in parts of Southern South America. We have the genus Leptospinace, which is actually endemic to the Antilles. We have Opuntia, and we have Opuntia, which is actually quite widespread throughout the Americas. And then we have the genus Gonzalea, which is another endemic to the Antilles. If we look at the same, you know, overall diversity, and this is a very small subset of the diversity that you would find in these areas, but the diversity of Cacti on Hispaniola, we can see some of the same genera. So we have Leptospinace, we have Opuntia, Mammallaria, which is much more common in Western North America. We have Melocactus again, Consolida again, Cylindropuntia again. So we actually have some of these patterns essentially repeating themselves, although in different species that are occurring on the islands. So how do we make sense of all of this diversity? One thing that's very clear when you start looking across the diversity within the islands is that you can see, you know, for instance, Cylindropuntia, Melocactus are not close relatives at all, right? But they oftentimes occur, you know, in close proximity to one another in these tropical dry forests. So we have this amazing sort of amalgam of taxa that occur within these seasonally dry tropical forests, but it seems quite clear that they work their way into these areas by different modes, and possibly at different times. What we do to try to understand a lot of this is put together phylogenies. So we're really interested in understanding the underlying evolutionary relationships of these taxa on the island. And so what we try to do is incorporate these taxa into much broader, comprehensive phylogenetic trees that are developed from more comprehensive sampling from continental areas as well as the insular areas. But just to give a very sort of quick overview of what we would expect in thinking about the overall evolutionary patterns of Cactaceae, is we have essentially 4 major groups of cacti in the family Cactaceae, 3 of which we would find commonly on the islands of Cuba and Hispaniola. And those would be, so this group called Leuenbergeria, which used to be known as Pereschia, but it's actually been shown through phylogenetic analyses, as you can see here, that it's not terribly closely related to true Pereschia. And then we have these major groups, Cactoides and Opuntioides. So those are 2 really large subfamilies with the bulk of the species diversity in the family Cactaceae. And so, you know, in terms of picking out members of Cactoides, we're normally looking at taxa that have ribs. They have incredibly reduced leaves. And if we compare those with Opuntioides, we have a number of other characters that we might see in the Opuntioides, such as glochids. If anyone's ever played with prickly pear cacti or nopales, you know, these tiny little pesky hair-like spines get stuck in your fingers. Those are the glochids that are only found in subfamily Opuntioides here. And then they have seeds with a very particular bony funicular envelope that surrounds the embryo. So I want to take a look at these 3 major groups, Leuenbergeria, Cactoides, and Opuntioides, and sort of put those into a little more context as it relates to Cuba and Hispaniola and other parts of the Antilles. So in terms of the overall phylogenetic patterns of the cacti of the Greater Antilles, this is, so imagine what you're seeing in front of you is the Cactaceae tree of life, and these yellow places are essentially the places where taxa that occur in the islands would occur on this Cactaceae tree of life. So we know by doing analyses like this that Cactaceae have made it into the Greater Antilles at least 13 or 14 and probably more times than that. Within the subfamily of Pontioideae, there have been at least 4 movements into the Greater Antilles. In the subfamily Cactoideae, which is a bit more diverse here, there have been 8 to 9 movements into the Greater Antilles. And then with Leuenbergeria, there's actually just been 1 movement into the Greater Antilles, and I'll talk about that a little more in just a moment. But I do want to point out that PhD student in my lab at the moment is working out the overall biogeographic history of the Cactaceae of the Antilles, essentially in its entirety, with a focus on the Greater Antilles, Julei Encarnacion. So I wanted to point her out here. She's doing a lot of really great work in cacti in the Antilles. So if we look at Leuenbergeria, and so in order to really determine what is going on and how we've had these specific taxa evolving in the islands, once we have a phylogenetic tree, as you can see here, this is an analysis by Erica Edwards that was published in 2005. The interesting thing here is we can see that these 4 taxa of Leuenbergeria that are restricted to the Greater Antilles, so on both Cuba and Hispaniola, 3 species on Hispaniola, 1 species on Cuba, are most closely related to these Central American and Northern South American taxa. And so it does seem that through 1 dispersal event into the Antilles, we then have this relatively small radiation of, you could consider them 4 speciation events, where you have this genus Leuenbergeria forming the small radiation within the Greater Antilles. So in looking at some of these, this is what these taxa look like. They're not your typical looking cactus. They have these big, broad, photosynthetically functional leaves, much less reduced than a lot of other cacti that you might be used to seeing. And you can see some more highly derived cacti in some of these photos, such as on the right-hand side with Leuenbergeria xenophlora, which is restricted to Cuba. There's a Dendrocerius, one of these more highly derived members of the Cactoideae, growing right below it. But essentially, Leuenbergeria xenophlora looks like, any normal leafy tree you might see in the seasonally dry tropical forest of the Greater Antilles. So I do want to mention that Leuenbergeria was formerly recognized as Pareschia, and it's oftentimes still called Pareschia. But as I was showing earlier in that phylogeny that I showed you, it's actually in a group that's separate, widely separate from Pareschia. And there are morphological characters that you can use to separate the two. And I'd be happy to talk more about that in detail if others are interested in that. So Leuenbergeria is one example of one of these in situ radiations that we have in the Greater Antilles, where we essentially had this 1 dispersal event into the Antilles and then speciation into these 4, what we now recognize as 4 separate species. Leptospinace is another one of these genera where we see that same type of pattern. And so Daniel Barrios from the Jardín Botánico Nacional in Cuba has been doing a lot of really great work in the genus Leptospinace. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But I do want to point out just some of the overall growth forms that you see in this group of cacti. So we have these really large trees, as you see here in Leptospinace nudiflorus. And these are really massive trees with really dense wood and they've even traditionally been used for charcoal production because they form such a dense wood. Then we have smaller trees here in Leptospinace paniculatus. This is a species that's endemic to Hispaniola, also with very hard wood. They're oftentimes used for making furniture. So we have these, relatively large tree-like taxa. Then we also have these sprawling shrubs, as you can see here in Leptospinace maxoni. This is a species endemic to southeastern Cuba. So we have a really broad range of growth forms. And Daniel has been really interested in working out the species limits in this group and trying to understand how they're related to one another to really sort of build a predictable classification for this group of taxa. He's recently published a phylogeny last year. And what he found was there were 3 main groups of Leptospinace. So you have these 2 giant trees, one occurring on Hispaniola, one occurring on Cuba. And that's this, what formerly was recognized as the genus Dendrocerius, dendro meaning tree-like, tree-like Cereus. And we can see a really large individual here of Leptospinace ungulosus, formerly Dendrocerius. So they form these really massive trees. And those 2 species form a group. And then we have a group of taxa that are essentially all the Cuban species. So they form one cohesive group as well. So here's an example of Leptospinace sylvestris, a Cuban species. And then we have yet another group of taxa that are formed from the Puerto Rican species and the rest of the Hispaniolan species. So here's Leptospinace quadricostatus on the right-hand side of the screen. And that's this other group, which Duniel called the EPR clade. And so the interesting thing about Leptospinace in general is its closest relatives are from South America. So its closest relatives are not in the Caribbean at all. They're actually from continental South America. We've been doing a lot of work on Leptospinace on Hispaniola. And so we've recently published a paper, actually just a couple of days ago, where we look very in grave detail about the species limits in Leptospinace on the island of Hispaniola. And actually just described a new species from the Sierra de Bauruco. So this is a species that look very similar to a more widespread species, Leptospinace weingartianus, which is really common along parts of the island. So essentially within Hispaniola, you have 3 relatively common widespread species and then 2 very restricted species, Leptospinace demiscus and Leptospinace bolosianus, that are both restricted to what we call the southern part of the island, in and around Sierra de Bauruco. And so here's Dulé collecting Leptospinace weingartianus actually for this study. So we have a bit broader picture now of what's going on, at least on the island level on Hispaniola with regards to Leptospinace. And so what we're seeing here are these sort of, although Leptospinace is an in situ radiation within the greater Antilles and a portion of the lesser Antilles, we do have these radiations that are very much restricted to the islands themselves. So within Hispaniola, there's a radiation. Within Cuba, there's a radiation. And so there are these intra-island effects that are actually obviously help building the diversity that's on the island. One other group of taxa that I want to talk about tonight is the genus Gonzalea. So this is a super strange genus. You know, when you first see these things in the field, they form, a number of them form quite large trees. They have this monopodial growth. So this primary stem is monopodial, which means it's indeterminate. So it grows relatively rapidly and forms these, you know, quite large trees. You can see this photo. I'm standing beside Consolida microcarpa on the left-hand side of the screen. You know, it's a tree in upwards of 9-10 meters there in the Sierra de Bauruco. Consolida macrocantha here, and you can see a number of my colleagues standing at the base of that. So these form quite large trees. They're in these seasonally dry tropical forests, and that appear to compete relatively well with the surrounding broadleaf vegetation. You can see a seedling here of Consolida microcarpa showing that monopodial growth. So it's growing straight up and relatively rapidly, presumably to help them move out of this broadleaf vegetation and actually compete for light resources in those areas. So we have a paper in press right now that where we were looking very closely at the phylogeny, so the overall species relationships in Gonzalea. And again, there we see some island level patterns. For instance, Consolida macrocantha is restricted to the island of Cuba, so it's endemic to Cuba, and it forms this very cohesive evolutionary unit. And then we have Consolida moniliformis, which is actually quite interesting in that it's very widespread. So it occurs on Cuba, it occurs on Hispaniola, it occurs on Mona Island. We actually see that it's all within one evolutionary unit, so one clade. But there are other species nested within it. So it looks like we have a situation in moniliformis where speciation is happening via what we call peripheral isolate speciation. So where you have a relatively broad population and then these satellite populations are speciating into separate species. So it's a really interesting scenario, and it's not something we often see in other groups of cacti necessarily. If we look at the overall patterns in looking at some of these biogeographic and doing biogeographic analyses and looking at the overall underlying history of movement of this group through time, one thing we see is that given that Consolida is this, essentially isolated lineage of plants that occurs in the Greater and Lesser Antilles, what are its closest relatives? Its closest relatives are other members of this prickly pear group. And some of its closest relatives are South American, much like what we were seeing in Leptospinace. So it does have this putative, South American Antillean origin, much like what we were seeing for the genus Leptospinace as well. So it's interesting. We have another in situ radiation in the islands, and we have this close relationship with South American taxa. Within the islands and movement among the islands, it looks like we have, of course, both Cuba and Hispaniola playing a relatively large role in this. And then from the island of Hispaniola, at least within this Maniliformis group, we have movement into Cuba, movement into Jamaica, and movement also into Puerto Rico. So Hispaniola played a major role in the overall development of the diversity in this group. One other thing I just wanted to point out really quickly is dating this group and its overall origin. It presumably has a very, very young origin, dating back, at most likely 1 million years, if not younger than that. So it looks like probably the glacial events during the Pleistocene epoch actually probably had something to do with the generation of the diversity in this group. If we look at Consolida corallicola, so this is a species that's endemic to South Florida, the lower Florida Keys. The interesting thing about corallicola is it's most closely related to Consolida milspogii, which you find in East Central Cuba and in the Bahamas principally. And so this is one of those interesting situations where we can take what we're doing in the Antilles and actually apply it to some of the diversity that we're seeing in places like South Florida. So it's very clear that Consolida corallicola is derived populations from the milspogii populations from the Bahamas and Cuba. And so it's just this northern sort of northern reach of milspogii into the Florida Keys. So the genus of Pontia, another one of these groups that I've been working on quite a long time. It's interesting in the Antilles in that they're essentially two different groups that have made it into the Antilles. So we have this group that's principally Mexican and Central American, and a closely related clade of that group is the one that has made it into the Antilles. And then we have this other group, so represented here by Opuntia delinei. And Opuntia delinei is this complex of species that's incredibly widespread throughout the Antilles, eastern Mexico, the southeastern United States. And it is one of these other taxa that have made it into the islands. So we essentially have two different movements of Opuntia into the islands. Some of these are very complicated species complexes, where we have taxa with multiple ploidal levels, so multiple different chromosome numbers, and taxa that are obviously very closely related to other continental species, but these complexes still need lots of work in terms of understanding the overall species relationships and how to separate some of these species from the continental species. And it is even the case in certain instances that some of the species that occur on the islands could be conspecific with some of the continental species. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in some of these species complexes. And I kind of wanted to reiterate that as well with this Opuntia stricta delinei chiensis species complex that we get in Florida. It's also part of this really complicated species complex that occurs throughout the Greater and Lesser Antilles, Northern South America, and Western, Eastern Mexico. So, so there's a lot of taxonomic work, underlying taxonomic work that still needs to be done in Opuntia throughout the Antilles. So this is work by Alan Frank et al. From 2013. It's another one of these groups of Antillean cacti that have diversified quite significantly in the Greater Antilles. So this is the genus Harissia, and I have a couple of members of Harissia here just to give you guys an idea of what they look like. Harissia areaphora from Matanzas, Cuba, and Fernelii from southern Cuba. And the interesting thing about Harissia, again, is it's kind of showing the same pattern that we're seeing in some of these other groups, in that the closest relatives to some of the Antillean taxa are these South American taxa. And Harissia has an interesting distribution in that it's found in the Chaco of South America, it's found in northeastern Brazil, and then it's found in the Antilles. And so Frank et al. Hypothesized some biogeographic routes that this group might have taken to end up in the Antilles. But it's interesting, again, that we have this in situ radiation derived from a South American relative. So you see these sort of recurring patterns over and over again with certain groups of cacti that have undergone in situ radiations in the islands of the Antilles. So here's yet another example of one of these movements from the Antilles into southern Florida. So we see the same thing again with Harissia fragrans. There's another species in South Florida, Harissia aboriginum. And both of those are obviously have been dispersed out of the Caribbean into southern Florida. So it's, again, you know, this work is also kind of showing us how some of the floristic patterns in South Florida have come to be. So the overall underlying development of those forests have come to be. Phylogenetic is one of these other really interesting genera that occur, you know, very widely in South America, Western North America, as well as the Antilles. And it's a group that still needs quite a lot of work, especially with regard to the Antillean taxa. There's a relatively recent treatment of Phylogenetic for the Antilles, but there's still a lot of underlying evolutionary work that needs to be accounted for. And the interesting thing that I wanted to point out here, and I don't expect you guys to be able to read this phylogeny or anything like that, but I do have the two Caribbean taxa that were included in this phylogeny highlighted over on the right-hand side of the screen. So Phylogenetic royeni, Phylogenetic polygonus, you can see there that they're not close relatives. And so presumably these two taxa that occur within the Caribbean have made it there, you know, via different routes, and at, you know, potentially at different times via different routes. The interesting thing here is both of those are closely related to Western Mexican taxa. So we have what looks like potential long distance dispersal from Western Mexico into the Greater Antilles. So I've been talking lots and lots about dispersal events into the Greater Antilles, but I haven't really talked about how something like that could potentially happen. Well, Cactaceae, the bulk of them form these berry fruits. Sometimes they're dehiscent berry fruits, so they open up, exposing, you know, a really bright red or purplish pulp with these black seeds, you know, especially in the case of something like Phylogenetic. And presumably, well, it's very well known that they're dispersed by birds, and they're sometimes dispersed by fruit bats. And there are a number of other vertebrate dispersers that eat the fruit and disperse the seeds as well effectively. And so there seems to be a lot of potential there via vertebrate dispersers for some of these long distance dispersal events, but that's something that needs a lot more study, honestly. So the other thing about Phylogenetic, as I mentioned, you know, there really is a lot of work that needs to be done in this group. There are quite a number of species that occur within the Greater Antilles and Lesser Antilles, and there hasn't been any fine scale biogeographic work done on this group to really see how they move, how they've moved among islands, and how they've moved, you know, in and around the Greater and Lesser Antilles, and then even into Southern Florida. So this is another one of those groups where two species occur in Southern Florida, presumably derived from Caribbean populations. But it's one of these situations where we're, you know, essentially lacking data, and we need a lot of really detailed data to be able to figure out some of these patterns. So, so this is one of quite a number of groups that still needs a lot of work in the Greater Antilles. So one other group that's super interesting from this point of view, and it's kind of showing this other other patterns. So instead of in situ radiations where you have lots of different species that are derived from a dispersal event, you have one species here, one species there, one species there. And that's essentially what we're seeing in this group we call the Mammaloid Clade. So the genera Mammillaria, Coryphantha, there are a number of other genera in this big group of taxa as well. So these are principally Western North American species, but there are certain species that have distributions as far south as Northern South America. And there are just a handful of these species that occur in the Greater Antilles and Lesser Antilles. And based on the phylogenetic work that we've done so far, it's quite clear that these taxa are essentially what you could call one-offs. So you have Mammillaria prolifera that occurs on Hispaniola and Cuba. And then you have Mammillaria nervosa that occurs on a number of other islands, including on Puerto Rico and parts of the Lesser Antilles. Coryphantha cubensis, which is endemic to Cuba. But essentially what you have is a close relative on the continent, and then you have a dispersal event, and you have that taxon that's occurring in, one of the islands in the Greater or Lesser Antilles or the Bahamas. And so we have what appear to be these long distance dispersal events leading to maybe, speciation of one species, or sometimes even the same species. So Mammillaria prolifera, for instance, occurs in the Chihuahuan Desert, and then we see it on Cuba and Hispaniola. So, so it begs the question, exactly how it got there, when it got there. Was this a long distance dispersal event by birds? There is even the case for something like Mammillaria prolifera, that there could have even been human intervention at some point. That's definitely not beyond the scope of what could have happened in the underlying history of something like Mammillaria prolifera. So, but it is very interesting in the overall scheme of looking at evolutionary relationships here, is that in this group, we have, these isolated species that made it into the islands and no major radiations occurring upon those ancestors making it into the islands. So it's a different pattern than what we see in some of these in situ radiations. So we're preparing a paper right now on the genus Melocactus, so I don't want to divulge too much information there. But one thing that I can tell you about Melocactus, it's a beautiful group. There's a major radiation on the island of Cuba, and it's a complicated group with a bit of hybridization, a bit of whole genome duplication occurring, and there also appears to be a bit of cryptic speciation as well. And one thing that we are seeing from Melocactus is there's been lots of movement, lots of putative long distance dispersal events from different areas. So both in and around the Caribbean, as well as from South America. So it's a really fascinating group to tackle and to try to understand. And definitely one of the more complicated groups. So we have in this group flowers that are typically hummingbird or bird pollinated. And then these really interesting fruit that are oftentimes dispersed by birds. Sometimes they're dispersed short distances by smaller reptiles, such as lizards. So they're showing some really interesting overall patterns. But really, really beautiful group of taxa to study here. And so the Greater Antilles are essentially one major part of the overall center of diversity for Melocactus, and the other center of diversity is Eastern Brazil. So it's also fascinating from that point of view as well, that Greater Antilles form one of the major centers of diversity for this group. So, in conclusion, based on the groups that I've focused on tonight, we can see a number of patterns that emerge. So the overall origin of the Cactaceae flora within the Greater and Lesser Antilles is quite complex. There are roughly 3 patterns that emerge. So we have long distance dispersal events from continental North America. So when I was showing you the Mammaloid Clade, Mammillaria, Coryphantha, their closest relatives are Western North American. So the same for Phylogenetic, Western North American. And so that's one of the patterns that emerge then when we see these taxa in the Greater Antilles. But then we also have these very clear long distance dispersal events that happened, probably more in deep history from continental South America. And that's a pattern that emerges over and over and over again with these in situ radiations. Once in the Caribbean, oftentimes we get these in situ radiations in specific groups. And based on some of the dating that we've done, it looks like some of those in situ radiations are tied to relatively recent events in the Plio and Pleistocene. And in the case, for instance, of Consolida, probably most likely within the Pleistocene. So these are relatively young radiations that likely had something to do with the expansion of dry, seasonally dry tropical forests in Pleistocene, during Pleistocene glacial events. So you could think of the islands of the Bahamas, for instance, were essentially 5 times the size they are today during Pleistocene glacial events. So providing much larger areas for potential speciation and the movement of these taxa. So I want to acknowledge a number of funding sources, and then of course collaborators, which for which none of this work would have been possible whatsoever. And I do also kind of want to finish up here in saying that we're still just scratching the surface of understanding the diversity of cacti in the Antilles. There's a lot more work that needs to be done in determining what species are occurring in the Antilles and the distributions of those species. And so that's one of the major foci of my lab at the University of Florida. And I have a couple of different grad students that are working really hard on figuring out some of this complexity and the diversity that we see of the cacti in the islands. So that's what I have for you guys tonight. I thought I would stop there, and if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask, we can just make this totally informal, and if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, just go ahead and unmute yourself. And Lucas, do you want to continue sharing your screen, or?
Yeah, sure, I could do that. Or actually, maybe I'll take it off share just in case.
There are some questions in the chat.
Okay.
I have a question. Can I do it?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Lucas, this is Ariel Lugo in Puerto Rico with the Forest Service.
Oh, yes.
I am interested in Borghidi's work in Cuba. He made a case for the evolution of the Cuban flora to be under acidic conditions, dry conditions, which probably pre-adapts that flora and maybe the Caribbean flora to climate change, where we think things are going to get drier.
Yeah.
I was interested in your view about this idea of Borghidi's and how the cacti might fit into it. Of course, I realized that you only talked about recent events. I assumed that Borghidi was talking about longer events.
Yeah, yeah.
But your reaction would be interesting to me.
No, yeah, I think that actually makes a lot of sense, with regards to a number of the taxa that you see in the Greater Antilles, although, these seasonally dry tropical forests sometimes are extremely dry. And some of these taxa that occur there are derived from, putative ancestors that also occurred in seasonally dry tropical forests. Actually, quite a number of them are. There are others that are derived from more desertified habitats as well. So I definitely do think, and actually, if you took a broader look across even some other plant groups, like, some of the shrubs and trees that occur in these seasonally dry tropical forests, there are other connections to both desert and tropical dry forest in terms of the structure of the vegetation. So I think, an idea of something being pre-adapted to some of those really dry areas of the Antilles, I think it does, make a lot of sense. I think, one thing that does complicate the picture, and that's, is just thinking about the sort of up and downs in terms of the overall aridification of these places in the Antilles. So especially, I'm thinking specifically during the Pleistocene epoch, where you would have had, influxes of more moisture or wetter environments during interglacial events, and then during full glacials, presumably much more arid conditions. And so I think that has also made the overall pattern of what we see in the flora there much more complex, given that, you know, probably populations in the past have come together, they've been split apart. And so we see patterns sometimes that actually in speciation, you know, for instance, in melocacti that are probably derived from some of this, you know, vicariance through some of these larger, drier habitats in the Pleistocene being then split apart by more mesic vegetation as, you know, the climate gets wetter and precipitation increases.
Thank you.
Were there any continental connections during the Pleistocene?
So, you know, one of the continental connections that is oftentimes given is Garlandia, or the Aves Ridge hypothesis, that would essentially have connected parts of northern South America and the Lesser Antilles. And so, you know, that's certainly something that could be taken into context for, you know, at least other groups, maybe even some vertebrate groups, but it doesn't really seem to work out very well for cacti, given that at least based on, you know, what we think the age is based on a number of different analyses out of different labs, that the overall family is probably on the order of 30 to 35 million years old. And this Aves Ridge, you know, would have occurred roughly, you know, 32, 33 million years ago, something like that. And so the overall timing of the Aves Ridge does not really coincide very well with the speciation and or age of most of the cacti that occur in the Antilles.
Thanks.
From what you said, it sounded like most of the lineages, especially from South America, seemed to be more recent, like Pliocene onward.
Yeah.
So that would all be bird dispersal.
Right.
So two parts to my question is, are a lot of these putative colonizations of similar age? And do you have any speculation about what different bird groups? I work on Hawaii, and we think like shorebirds were one of the most important groups in their migrations from Alaska south through Southeast Polynesia and Fiji and so on. But I don't know the Antilles at all. So do you have any comment there?
Yeah, so in terms of the overall timing of these events, it does look like there is a bit of overlap. Well, I should say that the overall timing of the events for most of these in situ radiations, you know, via long distance dispersal, putative long distance dispersal from South America, appears to be quite recent. Mm-hmm. We're still working out some ages for a couple of the groups, but for those that we've looked at in detail so far, it seems to be very recent. And so probably Pleistocene age effects had a lot to do with the diversification of those groups there. In terms of the birds that could have been behind some of this long distance dispersal, we don't have a really clear picture of what might have been doing that at this point. I think we might have a better picture of what's going on within the islands, but long distance dispersal from South America into the islands, I think I would have to say it's just a bit more speculative at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. That's kind of what I figured, since the bird migrations from South America up to North America and so on are much more complicated than across the Pacific Islands.
Right. Yeah, quite complicated. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks.
I have a quick question. Do you have any idea of how old the islands, the areas are? And if so, is there any correlation between the number of endemics on an island and the age of that island?
That's a great question. That's a great question, especially from the standpoint of the Greater Antilles, just because it's very complicated geologically.
Yeah, I don't know much about it, so I just wonder if you have an idea.
So the island of Cuba essentially is composed of 3 separate land masses, and the island of Hispaniola is composed of 2 separate land masses. That the accretion of those 2 land masses happened, we think, you know, around sometime during the late Miocene. So let's say roughly 9 to 10 million years ago, something like that, which actually caused quite a bit of the uplift of the large mountain ranges that you see across the island. In terms of the overall diversity on the islands and the age of those islands, one thing that makes that complicated, so from that standpoint, you know, there are high numbers of endemics on Cuba. It's the, it's, you know, quite large island, but it's also one of the, has some of the older land masses. But the thing that complicates that too is it also has an amazing amount of serpentine soils. So there's a lot of edaphic endemism that you see on Cuba. So I think what complicates answering that question is whether or not the overall amount of diversity that you see has more to do with age or more to do with geomorphology. And, you know, this edaphic endemism, just because it's so heterogeneous on Cuba.
The grasses are very diverse on Cuba as well. Lots of endemics.
Yeah. Yeah, on Hispaniola, I guess the number of endemic grasses, very few, and there are just a handful of endemic sedges. There are lots of endemic cacti, and lots of endemic melastomes, some of these other groups that may or may not be edaphic specialists, so to speak. Yeah, that's a tough question. That's a tough question.
Hi, Lucas. This is Cristian Torres from Puerto Rico.
Hi.
Hi. Great talk, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a quick question. I work with the 2 Leptospinace cacti in Puerto Rico, and I always wonder what could have made one of the, a few of the populations of Leptospinace grantianus be completely spineless, and then not very far away, there's another subpopulation that has spines. And I see also a lot of differences in the sizes of the spines on the Leptospinace quadricostatus. I was wondering if there was some kind of hybridization that could have been occurring, or they, you know, that they originated from hybridization or something like that. Or in Culebra right now, I cannot imagine of any herbivore that will, you know, the plant will evolve for having spines.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, just curious, if this is something also common in other cacti in the Caribbean.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. So far, we don't see, you know, virtually any evidence of hybridization in Leptospinace, which may have something to do with, you know, their very specific pollinators, but we really don't have enough information about pollinators to be sure of that yet. One thing I will say with regards to spine production is it is very heterogeneous across the family Cactaceae. So even within one species, you can have very different amounts of spines that are produced. And some of this appears to be environmentally induced, and other times it appears to be more genetically controlled. So I've even done some experiments with the Pontia, and showed that different degrees of exposure to, you know, different degrees of sun actually can cause the production of spines or the lack thereof. But also there are just some genotypes within a species that do not produce spines and others that do. So, so I think that's something that kind of has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. I would imagine that in Grantianus, you know, and maybe even within Quadricostatus, it could be more genetic effects that have to do with spine production than environmental factors.
Thank you.
Any other question?
There are 2 in the chat.
Let's see. Oh, okay. So let's see.
Well, I'm happy. I'm one of the chat questions, Lucas. Thank you for that talk. I enjoyed it very much. A great escape from snowy West Virginia. I was simply asking, this occurred when you were talking about it off Warren's question too about the bird dispersal, but is there any chance that some type of ocean flotation might be involved in moving fruits around? Does anyone know? First of all, I complete ignorance of what way the currents flow, but would they survive saltwater, if that might have a role?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Great question. And we do know, I've seen firsthand actually the effects of hurricanes on things like Opuntias, these prickly pear cacti. They're moved around super easily by these meteorological events, and it doesn't seem to really affect their survivability. There have been some physical experiments done in freshwater environments in taxa that occur in and around freshwater, and essentially shown the same things, that there's very high survivability after being, essentially immersed in water for a week or two at a time. And in terms of fruits being dispersed that way, I would say there's a very high probability that that could happen. There are actually inhibitors in the fruit of most cacti that inhibit germination. And so germination rates go sky high once, you take the seeds through the gut of an animal or otherwise scarify the seeds. And so I would imagine that, it's probably even better for their survivability if you take them through a hurricane. I would think in general, hurricanes and other major events like this probably have had a lot of effect in at least some taxa and their distributions that we see, specifically things like Gonzalea, Pontia, which are just, you can't kill those things. And they move around very easily. This is interesting. Jacqueline Salazar says Melocactus is dispersed by iguanas in the DR. So another really, interesting mode of dispersal. So Leptospinace nudiflorus, this really large tree cactus that occurs on Cuba, is also very commonly moved around by iguanas on Cuba. And so iguanas probably have a lot of effect on at least localized distributions of some of these taxa. So Sixto is asking, is there any discernible species distribution pattern between the North and South Hispaniola Paleo Islands? And